Welcome to episode 186 of the show with no name. I'm your humble host, Nick, and in today's episode, we're going to be exploring this awesome old historic pioneer cemetery out here in Wilbur, Washington. This cemetery goes by the name of the Wilbur Cemetery. Let's get into this. There are a lot of people buried in this cemetery, and there are a lot of interesting stories I have to tell you guys. So I've decided to turn the Wilbur Cemetery into a 3-part series, this being part 1 of 3. I'm going to start this episode off today talking about Oscar Franklin Osborne. And he was born in 1837 in Tennessee, and he would pass away on August 13th, 1946 in Grant County, Washington. He was 89 years old. He was the first man to file a homestead claim in the Grand Coulee area. Mr. Osborne, for whom the town was named after in 1933, came to Washington in the spring of 1882, and he settled in Coulee in the fall of 1883, where he took up a homestead and timber culture claims. His homestead, where he lived for about 64 years, would be flooded by the Grand Coulee Reservoir. In 1883, Oscar's brother joined him and took up more land. They worked together on improving their estates and stock raising. The cattle stock that the Osborne brothers were raising were one of the largest stocks in the Big Bend country at the time. His wife, Lily Osborne, was born sometime in 1874 in Tennessee, and she came from a family of German immigrants. She would pass away on October 11th, 1958 in Seattle, Washington. Freddie Partridge was born on October 10th, 1895 in Missouri, and he would pass away on August 21st, 1902 at the tragic young age of 6 here in Wilbur. He drowned in H Lake 6 miles south of town. As quickly as possible, rescuers made it to the lake and began searching for the boy. At 8 p.m., the body of the boy was found in water about 4.5 feet deep. Fred and 3 other boys went out to the lake sometime during the day to hunt and swim. None of them were more than 12 years old. A report states that Charles Zimmerman, a tombstone man of Spokane, and a gambler who had recently arrived at Wilbur, came to them and offered them a nickel to go into the lake and get a duck they had killed. The boys say the water was very deep, and they were almost exhausted when they landed with the duck. When they returned to the place where Fred was, his clothes were on the bank, but he could not be found. No effort was made by the men to rescue the body. The boys were so badly scarred that it was some time before they would tell the story after they reached home. Zeb Phipps was born on January 28, 1868 in North Carolina, and he would pass away on March 16, 1929 at the age of 61 here in Spokane, Washington. He was accused of murder after a brawl in a Weaver's Ford store in 1895, however, and fled jurisdiction because he felt he couldn't get a fair trial. He came here to Washington, which at the time was out of jurisdiction. Ike Roberts was born on May 16, 1912 in Wilbur, Washington, and he would pass away on April 21, 1945 in Okinawa, Japan. Private First Class Ike Roberts had been on construction work at the Midway Islands when the Japs made their attack in 1941. After being evacuated to Honolulu, he returned home during the last part of November in 1942 and was married on December 6th to Miss Irma Luton. He left for Army duty in December of 1943, and sometime in January 1945 his son was born. He died of battle wounds on Okinawa on April 21, 1945, at the age of 32. I'm going to talk about the Aldridge family now for a few minutes, specifically Clara and Jack Aldridge. They had a daughter together that also went by the name of Clara, and she had a really interesting story. I was reading about their family, and I came upon a newspaper clipping that talked about when she was just 17 years old and she stole a horse team and wagon and eluded authorities for weeks before she was eventually captured. She would turn her life around and get married, and she's buried somewhere in Oregon. But her parents, Clara and Jack, are buried here in the Wilbur Cemetery. Clara's birth and death dates are unknown, but her husband Jack was born sometime in the year 1857, and he would pass away on November 19, 1929. Jack Aldridge, pioneer, found dead in cabin. Body found by neighbor Otis Martin in his little ranch house in Grand Coulee near Steamboat Rock. He was the victim of an accidental shooting, the entire top of his head having been blown off from a rifle shot. William Brown was born on August 30th, 1857, and he would pass away on September 16th, 1899. He was a prominent farmer who was found dead in the road near his home, when in some manner he fell from his wagon and received injuries which caused his death. Since about 4 years ago, Mr. Brown had been subject to infrequent epileptic attacks, and it is supposed that a sudden attack had seized him and that he had fallen forward from the high seat of the grain rack, and that one of the horses kicked him or the wheel of the wagon struck his head. Rexford Lynn Calkins was born on July 29, 1913 in Oregon, and he would pass away on June 12, 1964 in Creston. He was just 50 years old. He was a homicide victim, and he was shot in the head at a tavern. He was also a Tech 5 in the 398th Engineer Battalion in World War II. Catherine Clark died at St. Mary's Hospital the morning following the birth of her son, Gary. She was just 27 years old at the time of her death. She was born in Wilbur on February 11, 1914, and she spent her childhood at Wilbur, graduating from high school there. Nora Connery was born in Ireland on April 15, 1866, and she would marry her husband Thomas in Tacoma in 1889, and by 1893 they were settled in Wilbur, Washington. Her cause of death was brain fever. Mrs. Connery had been ailing for several days, but was up and about the house before she quickly took relapse and was unconscious, with the exception of 1 or 2 mere flashes of recognition before she passed away. Last but not least in this episode, I'm going to talk about Stella Davies. And she was born on March 3rd, 1894, and she would pass away on November 24th, 1895 in Wilbur, Washington. She was almost 2 years old at the time of her death. The saddest accident that has happened in this vicinity for a long time, says the Wilbur Register, occurred at the home of Mr. and Mrs. W.B. Davies, about 4 miles northwest of town, in the death of their little daughter Stella, caused by drinking about a ½ ounce of carbolic acid. The house was being renovated, and the acid, in moving things about, was placed on the kitchen table. The baby, almost 2 years of age, secured the bottle and succeeded in swallowing part of the contents before discovered. A messenger hastened for the doctor, but the terrible fluid had performed its work by the time he arrived. The sufferer lingered until around 9 p.m. I hope you enjoy the rest of the videos of part 1 of my documentation of the Wilbur Cemetery. Thank you.